that you can't do AI if you don't do cyber. And that's actually really how we frame things.
What does this integration reveal about the relationship between AI risk and AI velocity in organizations?
There has to be a bit of a change of mindset, I think, for risk managers or CISOs or CIOs or CTOs or whatnot. Hey, you know what? We got to be able to get ahead of the curve in some way.
Welcome back to the CAIO Connect Podcast, where AI meets leadership. I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, and today we have a conversation that's genuinely extraordinary. Our guest is one of the most consequential AI leaders operating outside of Silicon Valley today. He's Anton Bonifacio, Chief AI Officer and Chief Information Security Officer and Executive Vice President at Globe Telecom, one of Philippines' largest and most influential telecommunications companies, serving tens of millions of subscribers. Anton, welcome to the CIO podcast.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Those are immensely nice words to say. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anton, we have a global audience. They're primarily made up of your peers, chief AI officers, or leaders of enterprise across Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, also CEOs of AI startups, policy leaders, etc. For some of the people who might not be aware, can you just briefly tell them a little bit about Globe and also what is the AI scene like in Philippines?
So Globe Telecom, we are the number one mobile telco in the Philippines. We got roughly around 57 million customers in a largely prepaid market. So we have been, I guess, deemed as kind of like what they call the digital purveyor in the Philippines. Very famously, we brought in Spotify, Facebook, really enabling digital access, I think, as far as the country is concerned. We also were one of the founders, or at least one of our key startups is a company called GCash. It's a digital payments company. Think about it like the Venmo of the Philippines. Reach of that is now 90 million customers, thereabout. So it's a verb now here in the Philippines. You almost can't see that if you make a payment, you say, hey, you know what, can I GCash you? Then, of course, like I said, as far as the telco is concerned, I mean, really the main goal is, just to be able to connect as many people as we can and hopefully make a difference in their lives.
Just very briefly, for our listeners who might not be aware, Anton, what is the AI ecosystem like in the Philippines? Can you just tell our listeners, please?
If you look at the bucket of the Philippine stock market, I mean, the index is still kind of like your big banks, big real estates, big conglomerates. We don't really have tech companies per se, at least not at scale. Like I said, the most would be GCash, which is why like a big IPO is something that everybody is excited about. It's a highly regulated environment, almost a bit like regulations first. You'd say almost close to the EU. So I think innovation, unfortunately, is slightly stifled in that way. But I do think that the positive is that the Philippines, so famously from an adoption perspective, I think at one point in time, I think we were the number one users of Facebook, for example. So just the absorption, I think, of social media is pretty massive. I think we were the number one users of Viber messaging app, so on and so forth. So I think that's the exciting piece, is that from an adoption perspective, Filipinos love to be able to connect themselves through digital. So I think it's just the overall startup environment from a tech perspective is something that, we could still hope for better, but I mean, at the moment, I think it's pretty okay.
Okay, great. Well, that's very helpful for folks who might not know about the Philippine environment. And obviously now we know if you ever travel to Philippines, use GCash. That's going to be pretty helpful. Let's just talk a little bit about your journey. You've had an incredible journey. You started your technology career at the age 12 as the youngest BBS or bulletin board system operator in the Philippines. You were essentially running an early internet community before even the internet existed. Is there a line that you can draw from that 12-year-old systems operator to the chief AI officer sitting here today? What does that origin story tell us about how you approach technology, and what are the lessons for our listeners in terms of that journey?
I'd say two things. So number one, getting started with the BBS. So yes, that was pre-internet in the Philippines. My dad was working for government then. I think we were lucky that we were one of the first few families to have owned a modem back then. I think it was like a 24 baud old US robotics back then. Because my dad, I get part of government, for them to be able to connect to each other. But it was really spurred out of curiosity. I mean, it's like, look, it was there, and it was just such an interesting thing. And my parents have always encouraged me, I guess, to be curious in that sense. I've always wanted to be a power user. It's just a sheer obsessive compulsiveness of wanting to go deep in anything that I'm interested in. So I was able to start that BBS very, very early on, as mentioned, and caught that internet wave. And I guess relating that now to the whether that's a CISO role or the CAIO role, a lot of it I think is just also luck. To be perfectly honest, like I think I caught waves early. So like I said, right, pivoting, for example, from BBS. We started to run our BBSs using Linux back then, or open source, which when open source wasn't really a thing yet, or Linux wasn't a thing yet. So then diving deep into cybersecurity, because it's Linux, it's cool, it's CLI, it's code, and then taking advantage of that wave, starting consulting early, and then now also being lucky that, when the AI wave was happening, I was also right in the midst of it. And was very lucky to have been given the responsibility to strike that balance between AI and cyber, and now really owning, I guess, our AI and data strategy end to end, as well as implementation. So I think really the lesson is like, look, take advantage of the waves, always be curious, and have that obsessive drive to just go deep as much as you can in anything that is that you were doing.
You took advantage of the waves, but you positioned yourself in the waves. The waves just didn't come to you. So that, as a message to our listeners, it's not just, okay, I'm sitting here, let the waves come to me, right?
Correct. That's true. Like in a lot of ways, I mean, I think being able to see that, hey, you know what, this thing is coming. To your point, you got to also be able to position yourself, and of course, be ready to actually be able to take advantage and catch it. Right. I guess, like, along that same analogy, well, if you don't have a surfboard and you don't know a bit of surfing, then you're probably not going to be able to catch it as much as you can.
You're probably one of the few people, and we've had a lot of C-level leaders that have come here. Probably the only one who has three C-suite titles simultaneously. You're the chief AI officer, you're the chief information security officer, and now also the chief data officer. Most organizations, Anton, treat AI and cybersecurity as separate and often sometimes competing functions. Globe has structurally integrated them under one leadership role. Walk our listeners a little bit through what is that logic behind that organizational design, and what does this integration reveal about the relationship between AI risk and AI velocity in organizations that some organizations might be missing, because security is also key function right now.
How it all started, somewhere like, I guess it's now 18, 24 months ago. So I was actually in the US. I was in San Francisco. I do usually visit a lot of our key partners there. Then I got a call from our then CEO, who's my boss, Ernest Koo, calls me up out of nowhere. And usually when he calls up, it's either there's an emergency or there's just really something important that he wants to tell me, right? So like, phone rings, and I'm like, oh no, like he's calling, what is it, right? Maybe an escalation of sorts. He's like, hey, Anton, I'm here in Shanghai, here in China. They're doing a lot of cool AI stuff. You should also do AI. Do what you did for cyber, but do it for AI. And then that was it. And I'm like, okay, I'll pick my title, and I call up our head of HR. Hey, I'll call myself Chief AI Officer. Let's do the disclosures, because we're a publicly listed company. So I frankly knew what the title was before I knew what the job was. So a lot of it was now figuring out, and there's no playbook, right? Back then, like 2 years ago, you're like, hey, you know what does a chief AI officer do? There's nothing. So a lot of it was kind of like figuring out along the way. On a slightly serious note, though, I mean, kind of like, look, I mean, Ernest knows what he's doing. I think he's always felt that and always saw that. I mean, just because he is a visionary in that sense. And even our current CEO, Carl, also has that focus. And I'll link that later, for example, to him assigning data to me, is that I think the company and Globe has always seen both things as absolutely sort of kind of like, I guess, hooked to the hip in that sense, right? That you can't do AI if you don't do cyber. And that's actually really how we frame things. Like, for example, our current CEO, Carl, also my boss, he's always looked at AI as something that's not an experiment. To him, it's something that we got to be able to scale from the very, very beginning. That's why our strategy has always been focused on scale. And that was sort of kind of like that anecdote you talked about on, not dipping your toes in a jacuzzi, but really preparing for the tsunami. So we've always seen both AI and cybersecurity, rather, privacy, responsibility, governance, and at the same time now data as those key scaling drivers. And I think having all of those in one umbrella to make sure they're in lockstep, I think sets up for better success as far as adoption is concerned.
You have achieved 90% AI adoption across the employee base, a number that's most large enterprises and even mature markets can only aspire to. What does using AI regularly actually mean in practice at Globe, and what are the behavioral metrics underneath that figure?
I think from the very beginning, at least the strategy has always been, look, if we're going to do this, if we're going to drive AI adoption, we've always felt that we had to take advantage of our strongest asset, and that was our people. I think now you can see that a lot of the companies are sort of doing it a little bit more top down, right? It's like, hey, you know what? Identify value pools. Look at, for example, which the ones are going to drive most value, invest on those 3, 4 things, and then see, for example, what happens, right? So that's kind of like what I say when you're sort of kind of like dipping your toes in the tsunami. You're like, hey, you know what? Is it warm enough? Is it cold? What do we like this? So on and so forth. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think for us, we sort of don't see it just as a single top-down strategy in a way, but it's really a double funnel or a double engine is how we like to call it. And we've always focused on the first funnel, again, taking advantage of our people. So we've always been deliberate about the approach to a bottom-up and democratized, I guess, way to be able to drive AI. And although I think we're seeing more of that now as far as I guess strategy advice, driving democratization, so on and so forth, but that has always been step one for us. And then to answer your question, what does that necessarily mean? So for us, like when we say 90% adoption, we're proud to say that it's not just about, oh, you know what, 90% of our population use some form of LLM every day. I think the depth has started to really increase over time that, you know what, these are actually employees that are building agents. Or back then, we didn't even call it agents last year, right? We just called them Gen AI apps or co-pilots or whatnot. A majority of the 90% that actually build their own co-pilots or agents or AI apps are actually non-tech folks. So it's our marketing teams, it's our finance teams. And I think that empowerment of them being able to create tools that will help solve, I guess, their problems on a daily basis is really that strong factor. Our CEO famously, Carl, our current CEO, would like to say that, you know what, let the people closest to the problem be the ones to solve it. And I think that's a big part of the philosophy as to what's really driving it. Where things are now too, as far as depth, is that, you know what, our engineers are starting to really use AI to do code assist. People are starting to do vibe coding very, very recently to be able to create apps. So the citizen development efforts that we're doing is not even just so much so using tools to create AI apps, but now it's using AI apps to create tools that they need. So now, for example, now that we're sort of driving value, a lot of it is around internal productivity, to be perfectly honest. Maybe 70% of the key use cases that we're tracking that people are creating are in that field. So now we're thinking, hey, you know what, what's funnel 2? What's engine number 2? Is now going to be those big bets top down. But I think the soil is fertile enough now for us to actually be able to double down on those big things.
So the soil is fertile enough and it's bottom up. A lot of the guests that come in on the podcast talk about shadow AI. What is your view on shadow AI, Anton?
So to be perfectly honest, and maybe that's a result of, I guess, me wearing both hats, right? That, I'm both CISO and I'm both CAIO. I think there's a more deliberate way for us to be able to balance some of those, I guess, risks. I think very early on, it didn't really concern me too much. For example, that, hey, you know what? Oh, people can access ChatGPT and all of these, for example, SaaS-based LLMs. Because like, what does shadow AR really mean? It's also shadow IT. So I think from the very beginning, we've always had great controls that gave us visibility into shadow IT. We've had good policies that allowed us to control it. But in this case, too, very early on, it was, at least on my end, a deliberate decision from a risk perspective. To us, it's like, look, what's a riskier proposition? People, let's say, dropping confidential documents in box.com or Dropbox or Google Drive and it being exposed, or a confidential document at the time in ChatGPT. The worry about, oh, you know what, the big bad model is going to learn about our confidential data. Like, it's number one, I don't think, like, training really works that way very quickly. Number two, it's not like it's instant exposure at the time, right? Let's say, Sanjay, upload your birth certificate on ChatGPT. It's not like in 2 hours, I can query it and say, hey, you know what, where was Sanjay born? Like, the that particular risk doesn't necessarily work that way. But there are some valid issues there. But I think, like I said, right, a strong security program from the very beginning, which is why it's a key scaling driver, really allowed us, I think, to be a little bit more bold in the choices that we made as far as driving that bottom up adoption is concerned.
Since it's bottom up, how do you pick the use cases? Because there must be literally thousands and thousands of use cases, and that's something that your peers want to know. That how do you pick them? And the second is, how do you figure out the ROI of those use cases? Because a lot of your peers have, I mean, they might not have wonderful folks like Carl that you have out there. They might have a little, they have their boards and CFOs chasing them. So how do we so if you can just tell them a little bit about this.
So I think the board and leadership knows that, hey, you know what, it's not a one size fits all. Or, for example, like, say, things like these go through phases. So, for example, what I always tell, for example, leadership is that right now we're in our growth phase. So when you're in your growth phase, it's like, let's say, any new company or a startup, right? It's like, look, it's all about acquisition, right? You're not measuring revenue or profit or net income immediately, right? Like, that doesn't matter, right? Right now, it's all about growth. And if we have to burn through cash to be able to hit our MAU numbers, then so be it. And then we monetize afterwards. So kind of the same thing, like, our initial stages over the past, 12, 18 months was all about growth. You know what? We were just obsessed around being able to drive the adoption, the enablement, and, a degree of depth that we want. We wanted people to be able to start creating their own co-pilots. So to your question, for example, how do you identify the use cases? That's the beauty of it. The central part of us, the central group that I run, we don't think about the use cases. Use case creation is fully federated. And like I said, right, that's sort of kind of like that growth stage. Where we are at now is, now that we've driven 90% adoption, there's a certain level of depth. Now we're starting to pivot, like, again, like any other startup. Okay, hey, how do you now monetize, right? So now we're thinking about looking at some of those use cases. Which do we scale? Which do we probably sort of kind of like maybe, put a lid on from a cost perspective, just because you can't probably burn tokens all day. But that's now a problem. Well, I wouldn't say a problem, but that's just the next phase now of that evolution, right? Is now being able to manage that. And I think that's where the ROI conversations happen. I think, I wouldn't say it's a mistake, but I think what happens is, if you try to think about ROI from the very, very beginning, like any startup or any new business that you're trying to do, I don't think that's going to work out in your favor.
So your suggestion is, don't think of ROI right from the beginning. Think of it as a startup per se, right?
In a way, right? Like I said, it's a new business, right? Like, if you're trying to make profit on year one of your new business, for example, I think that's a very difficult way to start a new business, right? Like, so I think you just got to be able to look at it from a scaling perspective, as far as that phased thing. And you know what? Once set some, you can still some metrics for yourself, right? It's like when do you want to start monetizing? When do you want to start thinking about ROI? And I think a lot of that now is a conversation that you could have with the board and the leadership team as to what the priorities are. But like I said, at least in our case, we were able to, get some good buy-in very early on that, our first 2 years or first 18 months of driving adoption or thinking about AI was really focused around growth.
That's true. Now, because you're building AI systems and also threat modeling them simultaneously. So when you look at AI systems today, especially when you're looking at the growth of AI agents, what is your AI security posture today? I mean, what is it that you worry about? I mean, I've had a lot of people that come in and they say, "Hey, we're worried about rogue agents. We're worried about prompt injections." What should enterprise leaders be doing right now that most of them are not doing, given additional perspective that you have?
I'll answer that kind of like in both ways. So I guess kind of like big picture, what worries me is that just the speed at which the technology is moving is just so fast that it's very difficult for security and governance to catch up. I think in our first few years, like I said, of running this thing, I would say the delta between our ability to govern AI or secure AI and the speed at which we were adopting AI, there was a gap for sure, but I think it was manageable. Now, for example, we're getting into agentic type of endpoint type of agentic with co-work and whatnot. Again, I think that delta between our ability to secure AI and adopt AI has become wider, slightly beyond comfort, right? So that would be kind of like the big picture. On just a slightly more tactical sense, slightly related, I think it's also just that, right? It's overwhelming. So I would say number one, and you could see that also with the trends of cybersecurity companies. I mean, there was a big, massive stage or phase of acquisition, I would say 6, 12 months ago, right? And almost every big cybersecurity, like the technologies that they acquired or adopted, are like you mentioned, right? Oh, protecting the prompt, protecting access to the LLM. A lot of it is kind of like, SaaS gateway security based. But now, massively, and like I said, we're seeing that in our environment. The AI adoption isn't even so much so anymore about logging into a chat GPT and protecting, for example, what prompt goes out, or protecting maybe an application or a copilot or a Gen AI app or chat based app you're protecting to be able to manage prompts coming in. Now it's endpoint agentic. Now it's Claude co-work type of use cases. Now you've got to worry about Hermes agent or OpenClaw, but now things are running within the endpoint. And right now, there's really no great solution for it. So it's just massively changing and rapidly evolving. And I think, just being able to catch up on some of these things, I think is kind of like, that big worry. If ever what I'm seeing though, like I said, and which we, at least I'd like to believe we benefit from, is that if you do have the hygiene fundamentals in place from a security perspective, there is still that good degree of comfort. I mean, I think the companies that would be sort of kind of like, maybe tripping over their own laces would be the ones that sort of kind of like, did not really prioritize security over the past several years and are only trying to build their foundations and hygiene now, together with trying to adopt AI. I think trying to do both transformations at the same time will be very, very difficult.
So, Anton, just to follow up very briefly, you touched upon Project Mythos, and then obviously OpenAI has released some of this stuff. What are your reactions to Mythos? We had the Treasury Secretary call in all the leaders of the banks because there's a real fear about the danger to digital infrastructure, whether it's banks or airlines or ports or things of that nature. Uh, they've started talking to UK and other countries, etc. So that I think, uh, what is your perspective from that standpoint?
I mean, I think the Mythos debate, at least within the communities, the security community has been very interesting, right? There are, there's a faction, for example, that believes the hype. There's a faction that doesn't. Honestly, to me, it's like, look, it doesn't matter, right? Like our job, we manage risk. We have to be able to always look at both lens and account for all of the scenarios. So I do think is like, look, number one, working with AI, I think whether you believe that Mythos is capable now or not, I don't think it's a stretch to be able to believe that, hey, there is going to be that capability very, very soon. If it matters, though, the slightly pragmatic view, at least for us, is like, look, we can certainly prepare now in a lot of ways. So number one, for example, just as far as being able to adopt the capability of the model, I don't think that it's just in the model anyway. I think the scaffolding and the harness that you build around it, I think, even talking with the members of Glasswing that, we have great relationships with, even in how they're deploying it, a lot of it also depends on the harness that you build around it, right? You don't just, for example, let's say plug your entire code base or repo into Mythos and say, hey, you know what, find all the vulnerabilities or like, do exploit chaining. Like it's not going to be able to do that immediately, right? You do have to be able to somewhat point it in the right area to be able to find that needle in the haystack. And then how you now really, I guess, set up the scaffolding and the harness is going to matter. That's why there was an article from ISLE, I think, that they said that, hey, they actually just used Opus and sort of got into the same results. Of course, there was criticism that they just kind of like, redid the same scenario that Anthropic did. But at the end of the day, I think companies can already prepare, right? It's like, look, and I guess short of that is build the scaffolding, the infrastructure that you're actually now embedding LLMs into your CI/CD pipelines to be able to do some degree of code scanning, so on and so forth. And every process or workflow from a security perspective, whether compliance or security operations, it's high time to be able to put in some LLMs so that when a Mythos capable type of model does come out, you're ready to just plug and play. I think number one. And of course, number two, thinking about when it's now adversaries that have access to Mythos, how do you protect yourself? If ever, I think the good thing is that, again, the playbook around how to secure yourself doesn't necessarily change too much. Sure, maybe kind of like the patching concern is going to be there. But right now, for example, 0 days are not new. I'm sure the volume of 0 days might increase, but like I said, right, I think how to defend against those and the hygiene requirements are the same. It's just that now you can't dilly-dally. Now you actually have to implement all of these key hygiene things and get the right investments to be able to get there because, again, the threat is real and the reality is now.
For a regulated industry like telco, where you are dealing with, you know, customer confidential information, is the scrutiny a little bit higher? And what should your peers who are in regulated industries, whether they're in telco, financial services, or healthcare, be thinking about, Anton?
It certainly is, especially, for example, like I said, right, especially the Philippine regulatory environment, arguably stricter. Like I said, like, for example, our data privacy policies are a little bit more patterned after the GDPR. Filipinos in general, as mentioned, just because of, how strong the digital adoption is in the country, more sensitive to privacy and security issues. Back then, I think the way that companies approach sort of kind of like regulatory requirements was also very reactive in that sense, right? It's like, look, wait for what the regulator would say and then act. Again, right now, at the speed of how AI-driven threats or AI threats are happening, I don't think regulation can also keep up. Best practices can keep up, right? Like, for example, the list, for example, of, hey, what to do, even if it's not regulatory driven, almost kind of like evolves and changes on a daily basis. So I think it's like, there has to be a bit of a change of mindset. I think for risk managers or CISOs or CIOs or CTOs or whatnot, hey, you know what? We got to be able to get ahead of the curve in some way. We shouldn't be afraid to somewhat experiment or not necessarily just react to regulation. I think there's that idea that, hey, you know what, you want to pass audits or whatnot, so you sort of want to wait what the regulator will say. You don't want to overdo something. But I think at this point, it's better to overdo or to somewhat experiment rather than falling a step behind.
Anton, one of the key topics we've touched a little bit on this is agentic AI and AI agents. From a governance standpoint, what is Globe doing and what should others be doing just to make sure they're fantastic, they're great, but if there are either rogue agents or things somehow go wrong, where is accountability for that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So number one, there's agentic that is built out of existing, I would say, workflows and business contexts, right? So that I think is where it's a little bit easier to drive that adoption. For example, what a broadband application process looks like, and trying to automate that, for example, or orchestrate it through agents is a little bit more deterministic in that sense. So there's a little bit of more comfort. Where, for example, I get a little bit uncomfortable, which is why, for example, we haven't really allowed OpenClaw, or even, for example, the way that we allow maybe co-work to be used is a little bit more tricky, just because the worry is, hey, you know what, agents will try to figure out a way to do the task, almost in a very obsessed fashion that they would go off rails. So I think processes that don't really have that much guardrails or are not as figured out, not as well documented, is where sort of kind of like, hey, you know what, there might be a bit of discomfort there, which is why I think I mentioned, for example, as far as scaling drivers, let's say for AI, technology modernization, data readiness, process, for example, is a big thing. So that's why we do have a process transformation program ongoing. It's not being led out of my AI or security functions. There is a separate team that leads process transformation. So we're sort of able to, I think, ensure that the process maturity is there, because that I think is what will give us a degree of comfort as to what we're actually agentifying, so that, to your point, right, it doesn't go rogue. That said, I do think that existing control capabilities are somewhat there. That's why, to me, like the hygiene and the foundations that a company has built from a security tech perspective is important. So number one, for example, is identity. Whether or not, for example, right now, identity is assigned exclusively to an agent, that there is exclusive independent agent identity, or if the agent inherits, for example, the employee identity, but being able to ensure that identity is there, roles are there, it is defined, I think already helps a lot. And then, the second piece is observability. I think a lot of the automated workflows at the moment anyway, number one, inherits employee credentials and access. If you have visibility, for example, into the different workflows or processes that can be done, similar to what a human can do, I think you already have that base, right? I think what really changes with agentic is just the speed at which these human-based workflows also get executed anyhow. Sure, there might be some changes in how we do a bit of that behavioral detection capabilities, but I think just having the basics is good enough to be able to see what a human can do, because an agent is still going to do what a human does, albeit just at a different pace and a different creativity level, I guess.
Anton, when you're applying agents, you're looking at workflow within the organization as to how can I improve workflow. As a chief AI officer, are you looking at your existing workflow, or are you saying, hey, agents allow me to actually change and maybe completely rethink what is happening? So, how is Globe doing it? Would tell our listeners a little bit about how you're doing it.
So the first funnel is that bottom-up democratized approach. People, for example, as they try to solve things, it's actually a mix of both. Some are automating existing workflows. Some are now able to rethink particularly new ways to do work. So for example, our finance teams, for example, have been doing an amazing job. A big part of it is just because they already had kind of like a lot of analytics experts that they use Python and whatnot. So just the adoption, I think, of the tech has been easier for them. They already have kind of like an agentic Mancom, for example, that helps them with a lot of things. We've changed the way that we do risk modeling and risk management in a lot of ways, and wargaming. So there are some existing ones and there are some new ones. As far as the second funnel, which is really more of the top-down transformational stuff, I would say it's more of the latter. Where we're really now rethinking what are the ideal target states from a customer experience journey that we want to be able to achieve. Things, for example, that we have not probably imagined possible before, on how we can, for example, really change the way and increase, whether it's increase NPS or increase, I guess, market share, that, we can really drive change as far as customer experience is concerned. That is where we're being a little bit more creative, I think, and really defining a target state and trying to work from there. But it's not about, hey, let's boil the ocean, look at everything that's wrong with data, and then just try to fix it retroactively. We're hinging it a little bit more with, hey, for example, let's say, how do we actually want to change the like I said, right, broadband or postpaid application experience? What does it take for us to be able to get there? What is that target state? Then now we work back and say, hey, okay, what are currently data quality issues that's preventing us from doing that? What are legacy tech issues that's preventing us from doing that? Is there an API that is not available that we should probably be building so that we can actually do that orchestration? And then now it gets to the agents, right? But even before you get to that agentic workflow and designing it, there's actually a lot of things that you have to be able to fix down the line. That's why a lot of these transformations aren't really just an AI transformation. It's really an overall end-to-end transformation hinged on what these target experiences that you guys are looking for.
Anton, many organizations talk about responsible AI. It's as a checkpoint that can slow things down. How does Globe use its responsible AI framework in the process?
It's balancing, I guess, how much of a gate, and it's both kind of like governance and security and responsible AI. For us, the philosophy has really been like, look, we got to be able to shift left things as much as possible. So, the whole DevSecOps concept, I think, applies even to how we do governance. The more that we could do that at the start or at the conception of things, and again, of course, it's easier said than done, but it is the driving philosophy. I think where things have changed for us, maybe just to be able to help out, some of my peers that are listening, in a lot of ways, the shift left shift left governance, policy as code, whatever. We tried to throw products at the problem for the past 2 years, and we massively failed at it. What we realize is that, it's actually a people and process driven transformation. Number one, we needed the right people. We actually needed engineering driven type of mindset within our teams. So instead of, for example, hiring, let's say, security auditors or governance folks or so on and so forth, we did have to infuse a lot of cloud engineers that had no idea of what really security or governance or whatever, or let's say, privacy or responsible AI was. But it was just a very, very different mindset for them that, hey, how do you actually empower people to be able to govern themselves? Because I think the core thesis is that, in a lot of ways, especially within Globe, Globe engagement levels, employee engagement levels are actually also massive. I think we're like at 92% or something to that degree, right? People love the company. People love our customers. People will want to do the right thing. And I think if you're able to empower them and enable them to do the right thing, give them the tools to be able to secure themselves or to be able to audit their own applications or their own projects, they will do it. So in a lot of ways, that's really it, is that we try to shift left things as much as possible, whether through a self-service capability or whether, like I said, implement a lot of these policies as code. So everything is as automated, everything is as frictionless as possible. That is how we're able to balance, I guess, sort of kind of like that speed to market and still ensuring that, the degree of responsibility is there as far as, feeling comfortable that we're not going to break anything or we're not going to break the trust, I guess, of our customer base.
So not break the trust of the customer base, Anton. When you are at work, I mean, how do you shift that? I am a chief AI officer, I'm a a security officer, I'm a CDO,
So
and
number
sometimes
one,
they are in conflict with each other
yes,
too.
yes, absolutely. So number one, as a company, and I guess even personally, I think it's number one is just being purpose driven, which we are. I think the way sometimes to simplify these things is just like, look, know what it is that we're trying to achieve. And I think it defaulting always to how we truly want to change the lives of our customers and to be able to contribute to, building our nation is a big thing, right? It's like, look, there is that strong aspiration personally and from the company as Globe Telecom to really be able to change the lives of Filipinos. So that's number one, and that's a cheesy answer. But maybe the tactical implementation of that, and this is probably what you're probably not expecting. Honestly, it's physical and mental health. Like, look, I don't drink alcohol. I exercise every day. I try to eat right because I always have to be at that physical, top tier mental and physical state. Because if I'm not, then I'm not going to be able to do my job. So I try to sleep early. I try to exercise. I try to make sure that I'm healthy, both mentally and physically. I play computer games on the weekend as much as I can so that I do have that break. I'm a big geek. Diablo 4 is out for my peers that also play. So I think that life balance ensures that at the key points at the job, that I do have to context switch or to the conflicts are there and it's Jekyll and Hyde, that I think really having that mental and physical health is what allows me to really just stay sharp.
Uh, Anton, at the end, we have a lightning round of questions for our social media team that loves this and our TikTok oriented audience. So you ready? It'll be just one word answer for you. Open source or proprietary?
Open source.
Build, buy, or partner?
All.
The one AI use case every telco should have deployed yesterday.
Give everybody access.
Okay. Agentic AI, is it production ready or is it still a science project?
Production ready.
Code generators or human coders? Which one?
Human in the loop, but use
Human
code
in the loop.
generators.
But use code generators. Awesome. Anton, thank you so much for being on the CIO podcast. Your story really from being the youngest BBS operator in Philippines to the country's first chief AI officer, along with chief data officer, chief information security officer, is really the kind of journey this podcast was built to share. And we really believe that some of the most consequential AI work in the world is happening outside of Silicon Valley. And that Globe Telecom is really proof of that. And your audience includes people who are building enterprise AI in every sector and every region. And your perspective across 20 plus years in the field is really genuinely valuable to everyone. This has been truly a great conversation. Thank you so much. This has been
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thanks for tuning in to the Chief AI Officer podcast with Sanjay Puri. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you thought. And share it with someone curious about the future of AI. Join us every Friday right here on the CAIO Podcast as we share more stories and insights from the leaders shaping what's ahead.